Hey guys, this is the last Bio 2 unit, Unit 3 for ecology for Mrs. Dickerson and Mr. Olive. So, um, this is it. Last class, or last unit, we talked a little bit about trophic levels. So if you look here, there's a couple of examples of marine trophic levels and maybe say a grassland where you've got lots of primary producers at the base, and then you've got first order consumers or herbivores and secondary consumers, if that rings a bell from last unit. The whole point of ecology, which we're studying, is just that trying to drive home the fact that biodiversity is a symptom of a healthy ecosystem, and that the less diversity you have, the less biodiversity you have in an ecosystem, it may be good for humans, but it's certainly not, and from an environmental standpoint, it's not hedging your bets. It's not going to be resistant to disasters. So biodiversity is a good thing. The next thing that we're going to talk about and study is a concept called succession, which is defined as the gradual regrowth of species in an area. So typically when we think about succession, it's after some type of, there we go, major disturbance or major disaster, what we'd call a disaster. So that could be anything from a tsunami, a big tsunami washing over the top of an island and decimating all the life on that island. What happens after? Forest fires that scorch the soil and completely sterilize the soil and eliminate all life above the soil, caused by lightning or human negligence. You've got volcanic blasts, mudslides. These are all things that are disturbances that initiate succession. So we're talking about two different main kinds of succession. One is what's called primary succession. So this is where life didn't exist originally. So the development of a community in an area that is not currently supporting life. So that's one example. And another type is secondary succession. So this is where there was life, like the two examples below. May 18th, 1980, when Mount St. Helens blew. Even prior to Mount St. Helens blowing, there was a rich forest, dug for forests everywhere, and big, beautiful lake called Spirit Lake with lots of life. And then Mount St. Helens eruption just sterilized all life all around it for miles. And then what came next was secondary succession. The Yellowstone fire that happened in Yellowstone National Park in the late 80s, another example of what came next was secondary succession. So, okay, back originally to what we were talking about there, primary succession. So the example I'm giving you here would be an area where the Earth's mantle, is able to eke up through the crust in a weak spot and form an island. New formation of an island takes place over a hot spot. And when this happens, initially what you have is sterile land, completely lifeless land. And it takes a little while for life to start to pop up. At first it has to cool down, and then you have nothing but rocks. And there's just a process that it goes through. First thing that has to happen is you have to have things that land on that island, and usually in the case of an island like a northern island, you'd have, like the picture there, there's puffins, there's a flock of puffins, and puffins bring their poop, and that's going to be the first thing on that rock. Is just seabird poop. Then seabirds will nest. They think that island is safe, and they'll begin to bring in biomass, grasses and things like that, and seaweeds, and they'll form nests. And after a little while, lichens, like this picture up here, show lichens can take root on rocks, and pretty soon erosion takes place and minerals become available for pioneer species to start to live. So pioneer species, that's defined as the first species that begin succession. So the first animals or plants that can start to live on an island that is decimated Those are pioneer species. After a big grass fire in a prairie, it's going to be the first things, maybe a dandelion that lands on there, or the first bacteria that might be in bird poop and starts to change the soil a little bit. Pioneer species. The pioneer species after Mount St. Helens blast just happened to be animals and plants that were able to survive deep under the ground. So if you think about a big layer, 3 feet of hot ash landing on the soil and just killing all the bacteria, but there happened to be some bulbs 3 feet down below, and then when those bulbs sprouted and came up through that ash, those were the first. That was the first life in that area. Camas lilies and other bulb plants were some of the first things to emerge. Pocket gophers had the same advantage. They were burrowed down well below the soil, and so when the hot ash poured over the top of them, they were down there cool as cucumbers, and they were able to emerge through the ash a little while later and start tunneling again, and that generated life. Rabbit poop, bird poop, things like that. When animals wander onto the area after it's been decimated and they poop, that introduces bacteria and things start up again. So primary succession, erosion, bacteria buildup, minerals begin to get exposed from rain and wind and things like that. And next thing you know, you begin to get soil, healthy soil that primary producers can live on. After a decade or so, maybe after a prairie fire, you're going to start to see shrubs, things like that, and that's what's called secondary succession. So secondary succession is a little bit different in each ecosystem. In the case of a pond that's drying up and someday it's going to become a prairie, you'll start to see grasses, and then you'll start to see shrubs, and eventually you're going to head on towards what's called a climax community. And a climax community is just that maximum mature community that it shows species diversity, biodiversity, and lots of plants and animals thriving there. And that's when you've kind of reached a stability before another big major disturbance comes in and wipes it all out again. So sometimes climax communities have a lot of detritus and debris biomass that needs to be burned or needs to have that disturbance happen in order to reignite the process. Okay, just a few questions. These questions are all going to be about succession, and hopefully you watched the Mount St. Helens video, so some of these questions are going to be pretty easy for you to answer. If you haven't had a chance to watch that Mount St. Helens video that I posted on Google Classroom, go back and check it out. It's pretty good, and it gives you kind of a cheat advantage on these questions. Okay, so question number 2. After a forest fire sweeps across the grassland, the soil has been scorched so intensely that everything has been sterilized, and for a while nothing can live or grow there. What are a couple of ways pioneer species might be able to begin to recolonize that patch of land? And how can life begin to reestablish itself in that place where that prairie fire was? So prairie fires don't stay charred and black forever after they're gone. You start to see life. And that's question number 2. So just think about some of the different ways life can reestablish itself. Okay. Question number 3. Camas lilies and pocket gophers have one thing in common. What did they share in common that allowed them to survive the eruption of Mount St. Helens and begin to restart succession in that area? You know, several years later, 30-some years later, Mount St. Helens took place when I was a 6th grader at Oakdale Elementary. And quite a few years later, you see big Douglas fir trees there. You see ferns. You see pretty close to a climax community. You can still see places where it hasn't reached. It's still going through secondary succession. But anyway, the first critters that popped up and plants that popped up had a little advantage. What was that advantage? Question number 4. And this something we learned from the Native Americans. It took us a little while to really get on board with it, but now I think we are. Native Americans used to light controlled burns over the prairies if they felt they needed to change things up a little bit. Now the Forest Service is starting to do it. The Forest Service appreciates the biodiversity that occasional controlled forest fires bring to various ecosystems. So explain why a smaller controlled forest fire might not be a totally bad thing in the long run, just for the health of our species diversity. Why would a small forest fire, say a 20 to 40 acre forest fire, not be a bad thing? This one's a little sci-fi, a little out there. I also teach Earth space science, so I every now and then I feel like I just have to stick something in like this. So um, right now, it's pretty far out there, but some scientists believe that it might be in man's best interest to try to figure out if we can make Mars habitable. That would be something called terraforming. Why would understanding primary succession patterns here on Earth help us understand if or how we could ever terraform Mars? Become a two-planet species. That's one of Elon Musk's goals. So anyway, Elon Musk is the founder of SpaceX. Come back to that one. Oh, just wanted you guys to know that you are done once you get done with these questions, done with Bio 2. And just want to speak briefly on behalf of both myself and Miss Dickerson. We've enjoyed teaching you this way, kind of. We'd rather have you guys in class, and hope to see you guys in the fall, some way, somehow. So we'll see what that's like. But anyway, those are the questions. I'm going to go through them again until this recording tells me I can't. I usually get about 15 minutes on these recordings. So there's question number 1. Hopefully you're able to pull that one off. I'm a little bit worried if you're a sophomore in high school and you can't do that one. Here we go. Question number 2. After a forest fire sweeps across grassland and the soil has been scorched so intensely that everything has been sterilized, for a while nothing can live or grow there. What are a couple of ways pioneer species might be able to get introduced into that ecosystem? What are some of the mechanisms that might get it going again? Okay, question number 3. Camas lilies and pocket gophers have one thing in common. What did they share in common that allowed them to survive the eruption of Mount St. Helens and began to restart succession in that area? Question 4. The Forest Service appreciates the biodiversity occasional controlled forest fires bring to various ecosystems. Explain why smaller controlled forest fires might not be a totally bad thing for an ecosystem. Question number whatever it is. Right now it's pretty far out there, but some scientists believe that it might be in man's best interest to try to become a two-planet species. Why would understanding primary succession patterns here on Earth help us understand if or how we could ever terraform Mars? You guys have a great summer and do good things. Try to stay healthy, and we'll see you in September.